On a cold October afternoon in 1814, London moved at its usual industrial pace. Horses clattered over cobblestones, factory chimneys darkened the sky, and laborers crowded narrow streets. No one in the St Giles district imagined disaster brewing nearby. Hidden behind brick walls, vast wooden vats held thousands of barrels of beer. Within hours, one of those vats would rupture and unleash an event so strange it would become legend. The disaster that followed was not fire, nor floodwater from the Thames, but beer. Fermenting porter, thick, dark, and unstoppable. It would crash through walls like a liquid battering ram, drowning homes and lives alike. The London beer flood remains one of history's strangest industrial accidents, both tragic and surreal, revealing how unchecked industry and human oversight collided in Georgian London. At the center of this tale is the Meux and Company Brewery, which was among the largest producers of porter in London. Its achievements fulfilled the city's thirst for beverages, but its massive size masked significant dangers. Colossal vats loomed over the workers, held together by iron hoops and enduring tremendous pressure. These vast containers appeared strong and reliable. However, on this particular day, a minor flaw would set off a catastrophic chain of events. This documentary explores how the flood happened, who it affected, and why it was allowed to occur. Beyond the spectacle lies a story of loss, poverty, and industrial complacency. The beer flood was not merely an oddity. It was a warning written in tragedy, sloshing through the poorest streets of London, leaving death and destruction behind. For many years, the beer flood was treated lightly by newspapers and the public. Jokes and morbid humor softened the horror. But 8 people died that day, most from society's most vulnerable classes. Their names nearly vanished into history, overshadowed by the bizarre nature of their deaths. This film brings their story back into focus. To understand how beer became a weapon of destruction, we must step back into the industrial heartbeat of early 19th century London, a city swelling with people, thirsting for porter, and placing blind faith in technology that was still dangerously imperfect. What follows is a moment-by-moment account of the flood, grounded in eyewitness reports and court records. The sounds of cracking wood, the roar of liquid force, and the sudden silence afterward form one of the most haunting episodes of industrial Britain. This is the story of the London beer flood, where abundance turned deadly, and a city learned too late that even beer can kill. At the beginning of the 20th century in London, beer was regarded as a fundamental part of everyday life rather than an indulgence. Because water was often contaminated and unsafe for consumption, alcohol became a more reliable alternative, with porter serving as the primary energy source for the working class. Breweries grew swiftly to satisfy the increasing demand, driven by financial motives that prioritized efficiency over safety. Bigger vats led to greater profits, and Meux and Company set the standard for large-scale brewing enterprises. The Meux Brewery was located next to the destitute St Giles Rookery, a densely packed slum infamous for its prevalence of disease and crime. Towering fermenting vats overshadowed the delicate brick and timber homes. The disparity was striking, industrial prosperity rising above human vulnerability, divided by nothing more than a fragile wall. Each vat was secured with large iron hoops. As the fermentation process advanced, pressure increased within. Workers often observed hoops shifting or breaking, but replacing them was expensive. On October 17th, a damaged hoop had actually been spotted, but it was disregarded as insignificant. No evacuation took place. The fermentation of the beer persisted, and the pressure kept building. Porter vats could hold more than 3,000 barrels of beer. Each barrel weighed hundreds of pounds. When contained, this mass was quiet and profitable, but if released, it carried the force of a small tsunami. No laws at the time limited vat size or required robust safety checks. Industrial accidents were common in this era. Coal mines collapsed, boilers exploded, and factory fires were frequent. The public accepted such disasters as unfortunate costs of progress. The beer flood would challenge that acceptance, precisely because of its unusual cause and devastating outcome. Insurance and liability laws were weak. Employers were rarely held responsible unless clear negligence could be proven. This legal environment shaped how the beer flood would later be judged, not as negligence, but as an unavoidable act of fate. By October 1814, the brewery vats were almost full. One vat, holding more than 1 million liters of beer, pressed hard against its wooden staves. Its iron hoops creaked quietly under the strain as the pressure approached critical limits. All that remained was a spark, a moment of failure that would turn routine industrial noise into roaring catastrophe. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, disaster struck. One of the iron hoops snapped loose from the enormous vat. Seconds later, the wooden staves burst outward. Beer exploded into the brewery with terrifying force, knocking workers off their feet and shattering nearby containers. The initial explosion caused adjacent vats to fail in a domino effect. Multiple containers collapsed, releasing a combined flood of porter. An estimated 580,000 gallons surged forward, turning the brewery into a violent river of liquid darkness. The brewery's brick wall gave way almost instantly. It was no match for the force behind it. Beer burst into the surrounding streets, racing downhill toward the crowded homes of St Giles. Eyewitnesses described a roaring sound like thunder. People barely had time to react before homes were inundated. Furniture floated, walls collapsed, and residents were swept off their feet by the fast-moving flood. A home holding a funeral wake was struck directly. Those gathered to mourn found themselves trapped as beer gushed through the walls. The sorrow of loss was immediately intensified by abrupt and devastating destruction. Several victims were women and children, unable to escape the rising tide. The thickness of the porter made movement difficult, clinging to clothes and lungs alike. Within minutes, the flood subsided as the beer spread and settled. What remained was chaos: collapsed homes, injured residents, and bodies pulled from the wreckage. 8 people were confirmed dead. None were brewery workers. All were neighbors, caught unaware by an industrial failure next door. Crowds gathered quickly, some shocked, others morbidly curious. The smell of beer hung thick in the air. For days, the streets of St Giles reeked of porter. Newspapers struggled to balance humor and tragedy. Headlines framed the event as bizarre, even absurd, often downplaying the human cost in favor of spectacle. Some onlookers reportedly scooped spilled beer from the street, drinking it. This detail, repeated often, highlighted both desperation and the surreal nature of the event. Coroner's inquests ruled the deaths accidental. No criminal charges were filed against the brewery. The incident was deemed an act of God. The brewery itself suffered massive losses. Ironically, it received tax relief for the destroyed beer, cushioning the financial blow. For families affected, compensation was limited or non-existent. Poverty deepened in an already desperate community. London moved on quickly. Industrial production resumed. The city's appetite for porter did not diminish. Yet the memory lingered, quietly shaping conversations about safety and responsibility. The beer flood prompted subtle shifts in industrial design. Breweries gradually reduced vat sizes and improved materials. It also contributed to public awareness of industrial risk, even if legal reform lagged behind. Unlike other disasters, the beer flood lived on through storytelling, rather than monuments. Its strange nature made it memorable, but that same novelty often overshadowed the loss of life. In the present day, historians cite the flood as a case of unrestrained industrial optimism. It reminds us that tragedy does not always arrive as fire or floodwater. Sometimes it arrives disguised as abundance. And sometimes, history forgets victims when the story feels too strange to be serious. Over 2 centuries later, the London beer flood remains a curiosity and a cautionary tale. It stands as a reminder that industrial power demands responsibility. The victims deserve remembrance beyond trivia and dark humor. The loss of the lives was nothing to joke about. Instead, it served as a caution etched in froth and shadow. The beer flood shows how ordinary industry can turn lethal when oversight fails. In the end, the streets dried, but the story remained. History's strangest disasters often hold its clearest lessons. In London, in the year 1814, those lessons poured out like beer and claimed the lives of 8 people.